Why, oh son, won't you just eat your vegetables? Sometimes the vegetables on the plates in our household seem to become an epic battle as dinner draws to a close, and we sit around the table wondering how much longer will our children take to eat these things, particularly our little Michael. And of course, I've occasionally complained in such a way to my mother, who reminds me ever so gently that once upon a time she knew a little boy who was reluctant to eat his vegetables, and that was frustrating too, but, I'm here. And I'm really rather glad that Michael doesn't have the ability to really engage with Romans 14 yet, because I fear he would point to it and point out that, see, the Apostle Paul tells us it is the weak who eat their vegetables, and I'm going to be strong and not eat my vegetables. Friends, eat your vegetables. That's not what's going on here. What's going on here instead is Paul teaching the church to be a place of welcome, first and foremost, really above everything else. So yes, eat your broccoli and celery and carrots and all. Please eat your vegetables. But also, we as church need to understand and live out and practice the virtue of welcoming others, even when we don't agree with them. Even when we have looked upon the same circumstances in the world and come to different conclusions about the ethical, even the faithful way to live in our world. Paul was addressing such a circumstance. Really, in the letter to the Romans, there's several circumstances about a church coming together from people who are not quite alike and need to work at getting along. And one of the things that they need to work on getting along with is the matter of eating those vegetables. Not really, it's actually eating meat, which is the hang-up. And Paul talks about those who eat vegetables as another way of saying those who decline the opportunity to eat meat. But this is not a debate about vegetarianism that we might understand in our own setting. This is something else entirely. Friends, and if in the coming few minutes you get lost in my tendency to go spend time in the Greco-Roman world and enjoy doing that, please stop and go back to the point where this is really about welcoming and community building and being covenant community with people even when you do not agree with them on something. That's what's important here. So vegetables and meat. What was at stake there? Well, friends, just a reminder, in the ancient world, in many religions, but particularly in religions that practice sacrifice, there was the idea that the gods were pleased, these are pagan gods, the gods were pleased when you sacrificed an animal to them and burnt a portion of that animal over the fire, which made kind of a pleasing barbecue smell that the gods liked, and that would, making those offerings would provide you personally, your community, with the God's favor. And so in this part of the world, a lot of religions practice this animal sacrifice as a way of achieving favor with the gods. But there was something more about it too, because it had been worked out over time that the gods really preferred what we might call the squiggly bits of the animals, those parts not even fit to make haggis. And so you could please the gods by sacrificing the animal and burning those squiggly bits over the fire, and the gods thought that was great, and the other lesser parts of the animal, the filet mignon and the T-bone and the tenderloin and all the way back to the rump roast, those lesser bits, those didn't please the gods nearly as much. So you could take those pieces, and after giving maybe a finer cut or two to the priest, is this really such a bad idea? After giving a finer cut or two to the priest, you would take the rest of the meat and do with it as you intended. So perhaps that was taking it back to feed your family, but often for people engaged in animal husbandry, it was taking that meat to the market to sell. And so in this religious economic world in which there is religious advantage to making a sacrifice because you want the gods, in this pagan mindset, you want the gods to bless your farm and bless your city. So you take your animal to the temple to be sacrificed, then you take the meat, the leftovers, so to speak, that happen to be the filet mignon, the tenderloin, and the T-bone, you take that to the market to sell. And so it's a little bit of a win-win situation. And so in these ancient pagan worlds, all the meat, really all the meat available to you, had probably gone by the temple on the way to the marketplace. And that is a problem in the early Christian community. Because in the early Christian community, especially the church described in Rome that is made up partly of Jewish Christians, but partly of Gentile Christians, among the Jewish Christians, of course, is the inherited from our scriptures, the Jewish scriptures, this aversion towards idolatry, and taking that very seriously, and taking also what you eat and how you eat it and how it's prepared very seriously. But also among the Gentile Christians, of course, there were many who were raised in this pagan background, this background of worshiping all these gods, and some of those individuals were wanting to break away from what they saw as bad behavior in the past, and also, friends, there was an understanding that idols weren't mere statues, but really might represent the demonic in the world. That in worshiping these statues, you weren't just going and saying prayers to a piece of stone, but perhaps the forces that had been come to know the forces that had been come to be known in the pagan world as gods, little g gods, might in fact be expressions of the demonic. So that they wanted to, many within the church wanted to stay miles away from that sort of meat sacrificed to idols. But when you were, as the early Christians in Rome were, a very tiny minority community, it can be very hard to carve out your own space in the world. And so that's where some of the difficulty comes in. Some of the early Christians in this early church had good reason to say, I am not going to eat meat which has come through the temple on its way to the marketplace, and that might be almost all the meat there is. And if there's some that hadn't been there, I won't know that because most of it's been. So I'm going to take an ethical stand to eat no meat, and therefore eat my vegetables, eat no meat, so that I don't intentionally or unintentionally take part in this pagan ritual. You've got some people saying that. And some people saying it in the way that this is how we must be. It is utterly unacceptable to eat meat that could have been, probably was, offered to an idol in a temple. That is a problematic behavior. We can't do it. We can't engage in it. And so you've got some people in the church who are able to do this and able to take their stand and think, well, kind of highly of themselves for being able to take that stand. I have the strength. I have the ability to turn down this food. I can eat my vegetables. I like broccoli. They can be proud of that. But it's not so simple for everyone in the church. And this gets into what life was like in the ancient Greco-Roman world, especially for those kind of further down the socioeconomic ladder. Because in this time and place, the structures that we really rely on government to provide for policing and security and ensuring that by and large everyone is treated fairly, that existed to a much smaller extent. You could not rely, if, say, you're running a shop in the marketplace selling clothing, if someone comes and steals from you, even holds you at knife point and takes your money and your goods and runs off, you may not be able to rely on the official powers to do anything about that. And as I understand it, they only would if you brought the criminal to them and say, hey, this guy stole my stuff. But as an individual, how are you going to do that? Well, people associated themselves with those who had more power and influence, or they banded together as kind of a union of cloth merchants, maybe. They came together in some sort of structure to provide mutual aid and protection and support, and they didn't have the sort of insurance and health care and all these things we take for granted, but really give us the security that we need. So they didn't have these things. And for many people, the simplest way to achieve that was to associate with someone who had some more wealth and power. And so you would, as kind of someone of more limited means, attach yourself to someone of more significant means. And if you were someone who was enslaved, and of course there were quite a number in this time and place who were enslaved, including a lot of people who were in the churches, you might have no choice. You were legally tied to this person. And even in this world when people are granted freedom, as not insignificant numbers of people are, you still have a very firm social, if not quite as legal, obligation to your former masters. So you've got to pay your respect to the big man in the big house on the hill. And one of the social functions that goes on is the big man in the big house on the hill will occasionally have, in our terms, a pig picking. A big to-do where there is good food, and you're going to come and show up because the big man in the big house on the hill has asked you to be there, and he's expecting to have a big crowd because that makes him look more important. And so you go because that's what's expected of you, and you eat because that's what's expected of you, and you're also hungry. But that pig, or cow, or whatever it is, has been sacrificed to an idol. And prayers have been said for the big man in the big house on the hill for his well-being. So eating that food, going to that barbecue, is showing that you agree with and participate in this blessing. It's kind of a reciprocal relationship where the big man in the big house on the hill gives food to you, but you give respect to him, and that's the way this world works. And it's more about whether or not to turn down an invitation to a pig picking, but it's, are you going to continue to associate with this person who provides a certain degree of security and safety net in your world? And if you're lower down on the food chain, you may not get the kind of great meal that he's invited you to come to. So do you go? And it's a hard thing to say no, because saying no might mean turning your back on the relationship with that person who really does provide you with security, or if you're a slave or a freed person that you have to be in, you can't turn it down. and you can't turn down the food. Maybe you could if it's just for you, but this is the best meal that my children are going to get for the next several months at the feast, at the pig picking. And as a father of 3 kids, if that's the best meal I can get for my children for the next months, who am I to turn it down? And so, in that place, I take my children and we go and we eat, and when prayers, pagan prayers are offered there, we say amen and nod and dig into the food, because that is just what you do. But in doing that, I have made an ethical decision that the complicated situation there with the other religion and the food that's been blessed to idols, that those complications don't outweigh the fact that I need that relationship and I need to feed my kids. And so you get this conflict in the church where some are saying, you know, I have the strength and the moral fortitude and the understanding of the way things work not to eat this meat that's available to me because it is ethically compromised from the start. And you over there who don't have the strength to do it, shame on you. You're not a real Christian. And you have others in the church saying, well, hey, wait a minute. Because I used to be that man's slave, I have to do this. And this is the best meal I'm going to give my children for a month. Would you really have me stay home? And you have this tension in the church. And Paul walks into this tension, and he does something really remarkable. He flips it on his head, because you have the non-meat eaters, the vegetable eaters, if you will, wanting to say, we're strong. We can turn down that temptation of tasty, tasty barbecue. And the ones going to the barbecue might be bowing their heads a little bit and thinking, well, oh, shucks, I don't want to, but I kind of have to, and I need to feed my kids. And so by some calculations, the vegetarians are strong. They have the fortitude, and the pig-picking goers are weak. And that's how most people would see it. Those pig-picking eaters, they're slaves or former slaves. They're poor. They're the ones that just can't turn it down. But Paul looks at this and implies that the vegetarians are weak, that their faith is not strong enough to see that those idols over there are just idols. And those pig-picking goers over there, they're strong because they have a strong faith that realizes that there ain't nothing to those idols over there. And we should commend them for their strength of faith. By every other measure, the people that Paul calls strong here and the people who are called weak, that's a flip-flop of what everyone else would say. But in this instance, where you have some people who have the privilege to turn down good food because they realize the situation's ethically complicated, and some who don't have that privilege and may realize it's ethically complicated, but have to make the best decision for themselves and their families, you have both of those groups in the church, and they're fighting with each other and struggling with each other and calling each other names and saying, how can you be in this church with me? Can't you see this situation? Can't you see you're wrong? Friends, even though in the coming verses, Paul will flip-flop back the other way a bit and commend people who don't cause problems for others in these sorts of ethical dilemmas, I think it's revealing that Paul wrestles with the issue in this way, that Paul is able to see that this is a complicated situation, and depending on your circumstance, you may have to come to a different conclusion than someone else. And of course, we don't have quite the same thing in our world today, but friends, we've got to be honest. All of us in living in this world in which, where our food comes from and how things are made and what resources are used to make things, everything we eat and buy and wear and get, if we're honest, all of those involve some ethical considerations. And we could imagine a situation with people on the one hand saying, I'm not going to that store, they don't employ people at a fair wage, I'm going to buy only organic, free trade, ethically sourced goods. And you have another family saying, we can't do that and clothe and feed our children. And you can imagine the tension there, where there really are some valid concerns on the one side, but on the other, you've got to feed and clothe your children. And maybe in our specific circumstance, those aren't the issues that we would butt heads over, but we can imagine them. That's not too much of a stretch for us. And we, in this very highly charged environment, can also understand the idea that two people of differing opinions might get to the point that they say, I cannot be church with you any longer because you don't see things in the right way. You are taking a stand and doing things that are ethically compromised. I can't be with you. And that's not to say that this passage provides an ethical free pass for all circumstances. It most certainly does not. But I think what it does is indicate that Paul understands that sometimes situations are complicated. And sometimes what might be an ideal in certain situations is untenable for others. And that's a matter of circumstance and situations, that things are not always purely black and white as we seek to decide how to live ethically in response to God's grace in the world. And sometimes, friends, I think Paul is realizing here, sometimes faithful, good Christian people can look at the same situation and come to very different positions based on where they are and how they understand the world and what they bring to the table. Two people can come to very different situations. And friends, there is room in Paul's writing to the Roman church, and I hope in ours, to see that situation and realize that our primary calling as church is to welcome, and yes, to help people wrestle with the ethical implications of life and where we are, certainly. But I wonder if we as church aren't giving a more faithful witness to the world when we work on helping people wrestle with the big ethical questions and understand it and search together for how God might be guiding us, rather than saying this and only this is the answer. Friends, I know it's complicated. It depends on different situations. But again, I think that the challenge here, the challenge we find in Romans 14, is first and foremost to be a place of welcome, where we together seek to understand how God would call us and lead us this day and always. Friends, I hope, I pray, God be with us, God lead us, and God help us to understand how to live in response to God's grace, to live ethically, to live justly, to live mercifully this day and always. Amen.